evening, everyone. Welcome to this debate entitled 10 Years After the Crisis, What Have We Learned? I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you also to Aristotelis and the Free Thinking Zone for hosting us for this Battle of Ideas satellite event. For anyone who's unfamiliar, the Battle of Ideas is an annual festival of debate held in London with events all across Europe, and this is one of them. My name is Ashley Frawley. I'm Senior Lecturer in Sociology and Social Policy at Swansea University, and I'll be chairing this debate. A few words about how it'll run. The speakers will talk for 10 minutes each, and then we'll go out to the floor to get as many, well, to you, right in front of us, to get as many questions and comments as possible. So please feel free. It's very much a sort of conversation format, so don't feel like you need to be sort of passive listening. So we're now roughly at the 10-year point after the start of the global financial crisis. Although it began to hit hard in Greece around 2010 and 2011, a key moment was the collapse of the giant US bank Lehman Brothers in September 2008. So it's been about 10 years. And of course, the crisis was soon followed by economic recession and the emergence of economic austerity in many countries as government deficits rose. Many have likened the subsequent downturn to the Great Depression, particularly in Greece, which has seen political turmoil, hundreds of thousands of well-educated Greeks leaving the country, and a small humanitarian crisis in the early years as a result of the recession and troika-backed austerity. But time has passed. What have we learned? Has it been 10 wasted years? How should we view the global financial crisis? Was it rooted in the financial sector, or was there something much deeper at play? And perhaps what bearing do economic questions or discussions have on understanding some of the more complicated social and political issues that have arisen over the last decade, for instance, the rise of populism across Europe? So with me to discuss this in the order that they will speak, I have Phil Mullan, who writes on the economy and is an author of, among other books, Creative Destruction, How to Start an Economic Renaissance, published in 2017, and Aristotelis Aivaliotis, who is founder and CEO of Delta Chemicals, Vice President of the Entrepreneurship Club, which hosts the annual Business Excellence Awards, Kuros, and founding member and Vice President of the Liberal political party DRASSI, which is now in alliance with the New Democracy Party. So without further ado, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks very much, Ashley. Thanks to Arita and Free Thinking Zone for the invitation, and to Jeff and the Academy of Ideas for inviting me here. In terms of what have we learned, I think one of the more important things that we've learned since the financial crisis hit is about politics rather than about narrow economics. Because I think the important thing is, or one of the things we've learned, is about how reluctant established policymakers have been to try to get to grips with the severity of the problems which exploded both in America, Britain, and following on in the European Union, and here, of course, in Greece. That policymakers haven't, I would argue, even tried to fix the big social and economic problems of our age. Instead, they've mostly limited themselves, I think what has been a pretty futile attempt, simply to restore things to the way they were before 2008, before the crisis burst into the open. And as a result, we have a paradox to consider, which is what I'll focus on in my few minutes, which is that these enormous disruptions of 2008 and of the Eurozone crisis that followed have produced so little change, both in economic ideas and also in policy practices. In a different world, that financial meltdown could have been a real wake-up call for the Western politicians to start fixing their economy's huge deficits, their huge defects. Because all the things wrong with the economies, falling investment rates, lower productivity growth, falling living standards, flat personal incomes, all those things predated 2008. Those problems were there. They may have been brought more into the open by the crash. And yet, the people in charge have refused to get to grips with those longer-term problems. Now, 10 years ago, you'll probably recall, many people made comparisons with the 1930s and the financial turmoil then, although people were saying this is the worst crash or the worst crisis since the 1930s. But I think it is really striking how different the establishment response has been this time compared to how they responded in the 1930s. Because the 1930s, to remind you, precipitated an epochal shift in both ideas and in policy. The old sort of orthodox neoclassical economic theory was discredited, undermined faith in the idea, the old-fashioned idea that economies were self-balancing, self-equilibrating, and it also got rid of the orthodox view that government policy was really best about balancing its budget, and that was all there was to government policies. And those orthodoxies, if you remember, were gradually replaced by a new consensus around what I could crudely call state activism. You had the American New Deal era of active government intervention, which was followed by the general adoption of Keynesian thinking around a larger economic role for the state, and all this culminated through and after the Second World War in the quite widespread adoption of a welfare state, mixed economy model of capitalism. But by comparison with that sort of huge changes in the 1930s and 40s, I think the adjective that best characterizes the past decade's response is that it has been a status quo crisis. Very little has changed in economic thinking. Even though the confidence of the elites in the workings of capitalism was, I think, gravely shaken up by 2008 and by what happened since, their inability to come up with fresh thinking about how to make capitalism work, I think, is in very sharp contrast to what had happened in the 1930s. Also, I'd say that nothing fundamental has really changed after 2008 in how the advanced economies have been coping. Policy measures seem to have had really only one objective, which is to apply what are called sort of sticking plaster to the system, with the vain hope of returning things to how they were before 2008. And that itself, I would argue, continues a pattern of sort of muddling through by policymakers that goes back at least to the 1980s. There's a few small things changed, sure. Compared to before 2008, we got used to this acronym QE, standing for quantitative easing, which was the system whereby central banks have pumped money, whether it's the Bank of Japan, the Fed, the European Central Bank, Bank of England, whereby the central banks pumped huge amounts of money into the global markets. But even that was not really a new policy. It was an extension of what used to be called open market operations, as undertaken by the state banks. And even QE, quantitative easing, as a specific policy was not original in 2008, 2009. The Bank of Japan had tried it, not very successfully, 10 years earlier. But most importantly about QE is that it was really just a financial attempt, I would say, to try to stabilize the economy, rather than to fix the underlying sources of economic instability. QE became, in effect, the dominant status quo response. And you can say yes, and I know we have a financial services expert here. There have been some regulatory changes for the big financial institutions since 2008, but nothing, I would say, has been done to change structurally the relative dependence of the economy on those institutions and on financial flows more generally. Instead, the new regulation has been mostly an attempt to make the big banks a bit less prone to collapse by increasing their cushion of reserves. But otherwise, banks and the other financial institutions have been carrying on pretty much as before 2008, helping to push up debt levels again, representing, I'd argue, another status quo response endorsed by the political classes. Now, some people explain this status quo character of the response to the crises as due to complacency, or perhaps due to intellectual exhaustion, or an absence of imagination by the politicians. And, I wouldn't disagree with those descriptions, but I think we need to go a bit deeper to grasp what is different in the recent period to the 1930s. I think the status quo response I've been describing comes out of a more profound political shift that's been consolidating over the past 20 to 30 years, and it's one which is expressed in the widespread culture of anxiety and fear about the future. Again, to make a contrast to the 1930s, you'll probably remember the American President Roosevelt's sort of inspirational inaugural message when he was elected, came to presidency in March 1933, which began with his conviction that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Very much quoted comment. In contrast today, I'd argue that a climate of fear has instead become so institutionalized that almost every discussion about the future is framed by anxious uncertainties. And that applies to the impact of new technologies, robots and AI. It applies to the economic rise of China as being threatening, never mind worries about demographic aging and about climate. The effect is that most politicians, I think, recoil from doing anything transformative because they fear that it would be too disruptive and too dangerous. And that, I think, underpins the status quo response. While in the 1930s the elites were just as, if not more shaken up as today's by their economic slump, the difference is that then, I think, they still retained, Roosevelt and others, still retained a basic belief in progress, a basic belief in the possibility of making things better. But I'd argue that recently, instead, their counterparts seem to be more paralyzed by the anxiety that if anyone tries to make changes, they only risk making things worse. The best we can do, they say, is just to try to smooth over the worst excesses. But the point is that this doesn't even work for the elites, never mind for working people. Because I think the consequence of all those status quo policies of the last 10 years is that we now have almost exactly the same fragilities as we had in 2008, with most advanced countries teetering once again on the financial precipice. Thanks. Hence the recent tremors we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks on the financial markets, the volatility in share prices and so on. And it's bizarre when you think about it that a collapse that was seen at the time 10 years ago as the bursting of a debt bubble has been managed since then through expanding debt even more. So debt levels are bigger today than they were in 2008, not just in the countries hardest hit by the recessions like Greece here, or by in Ireland, or in Portugal, or in Spain and Italy, but also in most of the larger industrial countries, economies too, in Britain, Japan, US and France. All these countries, the debt level ratio to the size of their economy is bigger now than it was in 2008. Hence, those instabilities and the potential instability is just as profound. So that's a rather worrying, 10th anniversary, with, on the one hand, so little has changed that we're back to where we were then. But I think probably the brightest hope, just to conclude on, I think comes from the recent stirrings of ordinary voters here in Greece and in many other Western countries. Because I think in contrast to the status quo politicians, citizens are becoming so dissatisfied with things, not just economically, perhaps we'll discuss this after we've both talked, but I think more important culturally, that more people have been voting for change. Regardless of the risks, more and more people have been declaring that they're not willing to put up with the status quo as being good enough. More people want change, and when citizens want change, politicians need to respond. Or they become at best irrelevant, or at worst, obstacles to creating a better future.
Thank you. Alongside greetings for the invitation. I will concentrate more on what happened in Greece during these 10 years. As the crisis which has started in the US as a financial crisis has been transformed in Greece as a fiscal crisis. And has revealed the weakness of the state finances very thoroughly. It has revealed actually that we were not a normal country. Greece, I can remind you that has invented theater itself. So we all play theater even in our personal life, but our social life as well. So we pretend to be something else. The whole country pretended to be a very rich, developed country, which was not the case. The state went bankrupt, and has passed the disease to the banks, which were big holders of public debt. So therefore, in our country, the problem has the epicenter in the exuberant size of the state, which does not correspond to the productive base of the economy. This is the #1 structural problem of Greece, and very few have learned this lesson so far, even after 10 years of crisis. I can say that the bailout programs, the packages which Greece has been followed through these 10 years, failed to cope with this problem. Although they were economically necessary, as the alternative was an outright bankruptcy and exit from the euro, which would have unfathomed social consequences. These packages were hijacked from the client-based political system to conserve the rights of the public sector of the economy. The byproduct was the sacrifice of the private sector through the excessive, very high taxation. The taxation was supposed actually to sustain the size of the state as it has been constructed through many years of prior happenings. Through taxation, the debt problem of the state has been passed to the general population, creating a local private debt crisis. So we now have a public debt crisis and a private debt crisis. Why was that? Because Greece has been addicted in the past to a flux of new money after 1981, as the participation to EC had been rewarded with billions of European aid through the ambition to converge single system. Individual incomes to those of the average European. The European institutions, which were the donors of these funds, failed, however, to ensure that its use would finance a long-term investment scheme. With correct guidance missing, the governing political system used the bonanza to create a happy consumption-based society. The process had been equally inflated by Greece's ability to amass debt in the international financial market, building the debt crisis which had blown up in 2009. In this process, as in a classical so-called Dutch disease, the productive sector of the economy deteriorated through the years. 25 years. The response of both the Greek political system as well the European institutions, with no exceptions of the almighty IMF, had been pathetic. One can say that the big states of Europe acted in haste as they feared for the health of their own banks, being holders of Greek public debt, and they failed to understand the dynamics of the Greek society and economy. The weak response of the political system in Greece to the crisis has its roots to the outmoded structure of the Greek society itself, which is fragmented to many special interested groups without much of common ground to communicate between them. The productive base of the Greek economy also is very much fragmented, with myriads of small family companies, which are underfinanced, inward-looking, outdated, focusing mainly in services, especially commercial activities, with many of them dependent to the state as their major customer. The bailout programs failed to fathom this weakness and kept on building pressure for new legislation called reforms, to which these weak enterprises had no real possibility to comply. One other major flaw of the austerity program was the ambition to implement internal devaluation to cope with Greece's problems, as the outright devaluation was out of the question so long as Greece is a part of the Eurozone. The flaw in its design was that it had not taken into consideration the fact that Greeks are very well connected with the outside world. They know English, they have their relatives outside the country, and they can quickly adapt to the new situation by living it. 500,000 Greeks with higher skills and education have been already immigrated from the country, and the flow of these people increases every year. the internal devaluation as it has been implemented deprived Greece from the main capital which would lead to a future recovery, the human capital, its people. This is the general framework of what happened here. Within this context, one can say that although many individuals reach, maybe you who are present here, have learned a lot of lessons from the crisis, the collective self of the society have learned almost nothing. The bailout programs failed to fulfill their original ambition to transform the institutions in Greece. On the contrary, they have provided the necessary financial aid to keep the general landscape of the society particularly unchanged. Also, another lesson, we, the so-called reformers, have also learned some lessons. One of them is that it is especially difficult to change attitudes and habits in a society which are rooted in centuries. It is especially difficult to change the behavior of our political system, as this system represents the demanding aspiration of a social base which is adrift from the prevailing winds in the developed world regarding technological advances, educational needs, and which is hungry to compete for the always rare available resources. Given the habit of rewarding every claim and pressing of various social groups based on their voting strength, it is an understandable situation for our client state as it is. This is also the root of the rising populism in Greece, a social base which is addicted to receive whatever it claims, a society of high consumption financed from the high interest of European funds and additional loans, a service-oriented inward-looking economy suddenly has been cut off from the incoming financing and has been asked to change habits and institutions quickly, habits which are generations. The first reaction of this society, which we still witness, was to protest and avoid doing anything at all. This widespread demand for a freezing time and denial of change is the base of populism in our country, and beyond, I believe. This demand for immobility is the real power behind our current government. The problem of ignoring the lessons of the crisis is present to other societies as well. Given the fact that the excessive build-up of debt was behind the crisis of 2008, it is interesting that debt is constantly building up again throughout the globe. Some argue that this is not an issue provided that GDP or GNP is building also in line, keeping the ratio down. Maybe, but black swans occur all the time, and the possibility of a downturn in economic activity can blow up a new crisis anywhere, in a certain country or a region, even global. The lesson that debt should be contained, take into consideration negative scenarios as well, seems to have very few followers globally. The design of the euro contributed to Greek problems as it had not incorporated in its general perspective the inability of any given member state to follow the general established rules in the future. On top of that, the general rules had not sufficient checks and controls as there is no central economic authority to exceed national state policies. It is impossible for Greece even to think about leaving the Eurozone now, but as it has been turned out, the adoption of euro from Greece was a mistake, having now the experience of what has happened. Although, through this adoption, the country enjoyed the best period of its history for a whole decade. Sometimes, maybe, it is justified to have a good party, although you run the risk of dying.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to come out to you now. Do we need to use the microphones, or can people just speak? And I think we'll just. So if anyone has any, well, those who have questions.
I have one comment
Yeah.
what Mr. Mullan said.
Okay.
He argued that there is no response of the establishment, any change at all, in contrast with the 30s. I think one change there is. This free money, this pumping of money, continuous pumping of money, is a new invention which has minimized the return of any free capital. There is no interest. Interest rates are negative. And this destroys actually the wealth of individuals. This is a new invention. And also what I have seen through the years of later, the markets are controlled. Why is that? Although we all fear that there will be a recession, will be a bear market, nothing happens. The market goes. This control is something quite new. And one can attribute it that more and more big conglomerates control the market. There are not the states which are powerful now. There's big banks, big conglomerates, big companies which keep the market stable. Maybe under a secret agreement. Who knows?
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that. The contrast I was making, just to be clear, is between you have a very big crisis which is comparable what was happening in 1929, early 1930s to what people was talking about in 2008 and 2009. When you have a crisis, that creates a motive, or potentially that can create a motivation for change. And the point I was emphasizing, that paradox, is that you have this big motivation for change because you have a big collapse, and yet nothing really changed in consequence of 2008. I agree very much with what you're saying in terms of the importance of what I call financialization, but the importance of the economy becoming financialized based on pumping money in. Certainly that's new, but it's not new from 2009. I mean, I think the first real expression of it we can see was 1987, when some of us are old enough know there was a stock market crash then in the United States, which spread across the world. And that's when you had a reaction by Alan Greenspan, who has just taken over running the US Fed, who, rather than trying to stabilize things through pushing up interest rates, which is often what a central bank did, he pumped money into the economy. And that's the point I was making, that QE, while the term quantitative easing was not familiar to most of us before 2008, actually the central banks trying to stabilize things by pumping money in goes back to the 1980s. And we saw every time there was a blip, whether it was that stock market crash, or when you had the Asian financial crash, or there was a bond crash in 1994, then you had the Asian crash in the late 1990s, then you had the dot-com crash. Every time there was a problem manifesting itself in the, what you could say crudely, in the real economy, you know, impacting on people, the central banks, led by the United States, would pump more and more money in. So you've had this long-term decline in interest rates, making it easier to sustain things. And I would say that's evidence, I'll stop there, evidence not of the power of big business, but the fact that we are still in a situation that the state is increasingly intervening in all aspects of lives. It is that power of the central banks to manipulate interest rates and pump money in and provide all that liquidity, which I think explains a lot of what's happening in the so-called free markets, or the private sector. Stock prices are high now, not because the economy is doing well, but because interest rates are so low, and it has that distorting effect. The liquidity has to go somewhere. People can't buy government bonds because the central banks are buying all the bonds, so the money goes into other assets, whether it's property, fine art, wine, or straight old-fashioned equities, right? And that's why the markets are so high. So it's an indication of the markets being more dependent on the state than ever, I would argue. So to conclude, I agree, that is a new thing, but it's a new thing that goes back 30 or 40 years, and I think we're bearing the consequences of it now.
Yeah, a follow-up question based on what you said. Is this new thing that you are describing, which is not so new, governments essentially, or states throwing money into an economy is not that new?
Correct,
it's quite
goes back.
But is this new thing manifesting itself in huge redistribution from the real economy to those that are have all this new money to distribute, and this effect in the real economy and in people actually working in the real economy creates huge political problems, people feeling alienated, the distribution of income totally distorted in the last 30, 40 years, and people like Trump coming into government.
Okay, we'll come back to you, but I want to take a few questions if anyone else has any questions. Yeah?
Would it be justified to say that the reaction of central banks in the aftermath of 2008 crisis, meaning the influx of cheap money, would be justified as a historical, let's say, as a reaction to the mistakes made during the 1929 crisis, which was exactly the opposite. The reaction at that time was to hold back the money, and that contributed to the explosion and to the dissemination of the crisis from the US to the rest of the world. That would be my question.
Are there any other questions? So, oh yeah, go ahead.
Have you made any forecast or prediction when exactly this will give crisis and how it will be done, if you have a plan, a mind to thinking about that?
You got your broker on speedphone, so you can sell your shares.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. I want to ask both of you actually about a question that applies more to sociology than to economics. But whenever a major shift is required in a society, then apparently there must be a factor that pushes towards that direction. And that factor could be either destruction or brilliant inspirational leaders or the society itself. But now, for the first time in history, our society is aging. So the people who really have the need to push for change are not a majority anymore. And I wonder whether they are going to become a majority. So, are we in the perfect deadlock?
And last question, yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly marking the question to Mr. Mullan. Quick remark is that from what I heard, the issues which are global and issues which are national, one should be aware of both, and sometimes solutions are different. The question is, because the question for the Greek case, I know myself and we know we talked with Aristotelis, is what would be your suggestion? What should have been done instead of what has been done for the global question?
Global rather than Greek questions.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions. Don't feel like you have to respond to every single one, but sort of, and you can also, I'll come back again for questions. So if anyone else has something in mind, just hold it in your mind.
I can comment randomly to what I heard. That I think regarding what we see, we must not forget that the real reason for the problems of the Western world is the globalization itself. That the rise of new economic powers make productivity gains in the Western countries more and more difficult to be obtained. That is, competition from the new countries obliges the Western societies to adapt in a lower level of satisfaction. And I mean, as societies, which is a major factor of dissatisfaction in the West. On top of that comes the redistribution thing. For instance, the cheap money makes the big institutions, big companies, more and more powerful. Whereas the average person who has some money has no real power to invest it or to take anything on it, unless it goes to the always dangerous stock market. I think
And to the big companies.
or to the big companies.
And it's not so bad.
Yeah. But this happens internationally. In Greece, you don't have these companies. You don't have the stock market. You don't have real control of your money because of capital controls. In Greece, it's more difficult. So, for brilliant leaders, I think this is not the case at this moment. The deficiencies which are present in the societies and, are not easy to be led from brilliant leaders. Because in the Western world we have democracies. The democracies means that the leaders must be elected. They must be elected from people who are scary, who want maybe, as in Greece, no change at all. And one brilliant leader cannot go against the social forces which are present in the society.
Sorry, yeah, apparently just big right into it.
So in Greece, what should have been done? We should have confronted the crisis, sacrificing some of our state, to reduce our state. Instead, we sacrificed part of our weak private sector. And at this moment we are now, we run the danger that we will not have the private sector at all in some years, and we will have a very deficient big state with no means to be supported.
Is this one working now, or is it
Yeah,
just?
everything works.
Okay.
Everything works.
Yeah, so,
Right in front.
Yeah.
Okay. An important emphasis I would give is to see that the problems that we're discussing, when we're discussing the economic problems, is that they are primarily domestically rooted. So, without going into a long discussion, I don't accept the view that globalization is to blame for low productivity. I think we can look for what's going on outside our countries to explain what's going inside. I mean, historically, if you look at it, there was an earlier phase of globalization or internationalization at the end of the 19th century, which was seen as phase one of globalization, which only ended with the First World War. And by some measures, in terms of foreign investment and trade and stuff, it was comparable to what's been going on recently. But that was a time of fast productivity growth. So I don't think one can have a cause and effect relationship between what's going on outside with what's going on inside. And generally, I would always put the emphasis on domestic mistakes or domestic failures or domestic inabilities to address problems. Now, what is the fundamental problem? Here I agree with very much what you were saying as a general theme of countries living beyond their means. I think it's not specific to the state. I think what we saw from the 70s, but particularly from the 80s through to the financial crash, was a situation where, not in a planned way, although you're right in saying that lessons have been drawn from the 1930s, that the central banks can make things worse, but I think this comes on the back of what I described earlier, this whole sort of shift to an embrace of state activism, which was the effects of the 1930s and the effects of the Second World War. People could see, the policymakers could see that the state could actually have an impact. You know, they could even centralize resources to fight a war effectively, and that continued through into the post-war period. And that belief that the state, or that faith in the state, I think, is what was originally turned to in the 1970s. So you remember at that stage, whenever the productivity crisis happened, lots of countries turned to, let's really be very Keynesian, let's spend a lot of money through the states and hope that will solve things. It didn't. It created what was called stagflation. You had stagnation, but you also had very rising prices. So that was a situation which I think in some ways is more comparable to the 1930s. You had a revolution in thinking where Keynesianism got discredited, and you had the search for new ideas. And I think then, ever since then really, they've not really come up with anything, you know, the part of the anything new on a par with what they had with Keynesianism. People talk about neoliberalism, but I think that's more of a term of abuse than a real coherent theory. What did happen was that you had the state continuing what it had done during post-war years of intervening. Not that the powers that be just intervene more, but they also passed more responsibility away to independent institutions like the central banks. And I think that's a common theme. I think that's probably the most important development in the state that happened from the 70s, was that the politicians tried to take a back seat and passed responsibility and their authority to so-called independent bodies. They abdicated from taking political responsibility, and the central banks became more the driving people. Yeah, so it was much more, you know, not so much what Ronald Reagan was doing, it was what Alan Greenspan was doing in the 1980s, which was influential, and that continued through the 90s and continued into the early years of this decade. But living beyond the means was something which this state activity was making possible. I don't think it was necessarily a conscious thing in the sense of let us make everybody get very indebted. It was more that this was a way that you could respond. And in fact, I think what's characteristic of this period is this, as I said earlier, this lack of thinking into the long term, of having a vision for the future. Politics became very short term, very much about how to cope over the next year. A term I use a lot is muddling through. It's just a matter of get over the next little blip, and hopefully things will be okay, and then we'll throw a bit more money at it, and you know, companies will borrow more, individuals will borrow more, we'll all get a bit more into debt, but it will keep things rolling along, so to speak, and it's really just postponing the problem. And that's why this whole thing is just dragged on and on and on. So it's living beyond our means, I agree with you, but it's a system which has enabled that to happen. And I think to conclude, I think the significance of 2008, I think the real lesson for it is it shows the limits of that. It showed the limits of living beyond our means. And yet now, in the last 10 years, they haven't worked out another way of dealing with it. So we're back to where we were in 2008. Everyone's indebted again.
Was the issue that, so I just wanted to ask you, maybe both, was the issue that Keynesianism sort of didn't work, or that people went back to it, you know, just by default? Or was it that we tend to think or tell this story that Keynesianism was what got us out of the Great Depression, when actually what got us out of it was flattening two continents? I mean, it seems to be the, so is it that it's not a small thing, it's not just that we're sort of unwilling to, you know, we feel entitled and we don't want to go through the pain, but the pain is very serious. It is a very serious thing what happened, the amount of destruction that needs to go on in order to boost productivity again. That's no small thing. It's not just, oh, we're a little greedy and we wanted nice cars. I mean, it's more like, I think that politicians are trying to avoid the huge amount of pain, and should we accept that? Should we accept the huge amount of pain and destruction that would bring back profitability?
You're right, but in Greece we are in another phase. Greek politicians not only have avoided their own responsibilities, but they put their responsibilities to the outside politicians in Germany, in France, to the European institutions. And regarding Keynesism, Keynesism has been grown up in England, in the US, in societies where there was a productive base of the economy, and as a mechanism to make things more smooth. here in Greece, we cannot speak of change because we have a state who absorbs 65% of the total GDP. We are talking for a country where the state employees are about 1 million, if you count also the state-owned enterprises, whereas the private sector is another 1.5 million. And there is about 6 million non-productive people, pensioners or people who do nothing. So what change? What change can be worked in our country? In our country we should take the hard medicine, reducing the state, annulling the interest of public servants, and conserve money to make economies sustain. This hard medicine, no politician is eager to suggest. Those who have suggested in the past got nothing votes. We have a very hard experience, and it's impossible to be voted. Because the Greeks have some fundamental characteristics on the Greeks. Myself included. They are opportunists because their history tells them that history of poor condition. They try to avoid the hardships of the future by amassing wealth. In any given circumstances, they try to get the best for their project, for their family. They don't care about the state. They don't care about the collective self-representation. We are a very young society, almost 100 years old, and we have the weaknesses of time. We don't think generally.
So is it just a matter of cutting down the public sector?
So I think this is something we have to cope and to understand and to love our compatriots with this characteristic in mind. We cannot change their minds. I hear from many politicians that we have to change the mentality. This is something impossible. You cannot change mentalities. You can only work with the mentality you have. Those Greeks who have this habit of opportunistic amassing of wealth, we have to find institutions to work for them, not to change people.
Do you want to respond just before
Just
we-
briefly, yeah. Generally, different peoples with different histories have different, characteristics. That's certainly true. But I think there's a lot more that unites the problems which Greeks have as problems in Italy or Spain or Ireland or even Britain, right? I'm no expert in Greek history, but clearly, the history of oppression in Greece, even since times of independence, but the sort of informal oppression by the British and everything that happened during the 20th century, is bound to create a situation that people do want to look after their wealth, because if they don't look after it, somebody's going to whip it away from them. So you can always find historical reasons, social reasons for how a people has slightly different characteristics. But I think it's the common things in terms of the common flaws of what's going on in the economy, which is worth exploring. And we agree, I think, that there is a weakness, a fundamental weakness at the level of the productive base within Greece. And I will argue there's a fundamental weakness in the productive base in Britain and in most other Western countries. That most Western countries are not investing enough in the future, right? We have this idea that we're in an era of fast accelerating change, yet everywhere investment levels have been falling. I'm talking about business investment levels have been falling. Everywhere productivity growth has been declining. Okay, in Britain it's been flat, but even in America it's declined from 2% a year to less than 1%. So there are the same features that society in the West, I differentiate the West from what's happening in Asia and China, because there's different dynamics there. or in Africa, different dynamics. That, you know, why is that the case, that there's so little investment going on? And I think those are common features. I think it's very easy to blame the state. I mean, and we should blame the state for certain things. I've been blaming the state in terms of its role in terms of pumping money in and propping everything up. You're blaming it for the size of the state. You know, but I think if one focuses too much just on the state, you miss the fact that there has to be something happening in the private sector to take over. Simply removing the state isn't going to resolve the problems. My own view is that the state should stop doing some things. People ask, what should I do? But I'll come back on that later. The state should stop doing some things, but it should start doing some other things which can actually build a better future, whether it's research and development, whether it's building infrastructure or whatever, but we'll perhaps discuss that. So, but to simply focus on the state itself as being a problem by size, I think misses the point of what's really important is the underlying productive activity, which can then justify the taxes, which can pay a state to provide a decent services for the people who live in that country.
Yeah. Speaking of the state, it's not only the size of the state.
There's some people who want to
Your
talk.
book is about creative extraction.
Construction, yeah.
The state here is an obstacle to creative distraction. Has put laws in order to avoid, for instance, functioning the banking system. Nowadays there is no credit at all because there is no security for those who give the loans, that they cannot auction the house which of the people. Because the state say no. No auctions can be held. Also, the state creates obstacles for the auctioning of failing enterprises. It's many years now we discuss the same and the same privatization. Why? Because there are loans who are creating problems to make it quickly. And this is why the productivity is one of the reasons why productivity is falling in Greece. Because nothing is closed. All the obsolete companies continue to operate. No private ownership is changing because the laws protect the previous owner. And so there is no room to make something new. So investment is not coming because the actual net profits are very low. If you see all the companies you look at, there is no profit in any as an average.
It's very much.
Some bright examples maybe occur from time to time, but the general profit is very low. Cannot justify new investment. We ask for investment. We want 100 billion investment to be happening in the next 6 years, and we are seeking this number for 6 years with zero result.
May I?
Yeah, so I'll take a few more questions and we'll come back and give another chance to
Probably you know there is a song saying, don't put the blame only on me, I'm only just a human being. I think that the state could say so. I mean, we don't have to put the blame only to the state. And we don't have to put the problem only to the state because the problem of the state, to my point of view, it's not how big it is. The problem is that it's not functioning. I mean, the size is an issue, but the productivity of the state. I mean, if you want to take, let's say, to make an investment, you have to take more than 6 months to take all the papers that you need in order to apply for the.
6 months is not understated.
Yes, it's probably 6 years, but I mean, I have some experience, so I'm saying 6 months. Anyway, and also always you have to find someone to, some politician to make or someone to bribe to make your job. So I think that the main issue of why the crisis in Greece has been lasting for so many years. We are now in the 10th year and we are passing to the 11th. Is that all the factors that were involved in the Greek crisis, they did not at all their own homework. For instance, the the Troika, once we call the Troika, now we call them institutions, they, after the 3 or 4 months, they focused on how, not how to make business working in Greece, but how to just buy land and sources of for someone who would like to make quick money, not to establish a productive and to enlarge the productivity base in Greece. So not to make business in a